Chapter 43. I was brilliant at school next day. Nobody could get the ball away from me. I did body swerves and dribbles and flicks. I skipped over tackles, backheeled the ball to my teammates, scored with diving headers and with long shots curled into the corners of the net. After the bell went and we were trailing back to the school across the field, Leaky ran after me. "You lucky so-and-so," he said. "You'll never play like that again." I laughed. "Look? What about this then?" I dropped the ball and dribbled it round him. I flicked it between his legs and ran on with it. Then he got me with a thumping tackle into the back of my legs that sent us both sprawling. "Foul!" I shouted. "Foul!" We started wrestling, rolling over and over on the grass. He was bigger than me and he pinned me down, sat over me and pressed my shoulders into the ground, but he was grinning. "Say it again," he said. "Foul! It was a foul!" I shouted. He lifted his fist as though he was going to smash me in the face, but then he just laughed and flopped down and lay beside me like the friend he was. "Oh," he said, "you were brilliant." We lay there laughing. Then Mrs. Dando started yelling, "Get in, you two! Are you going to be late?" We walked together towards school. "It's like you've been miles and miles away recently," he said. "I know," I said. "You going to tell me about it?" he asked casually. We paused and I looked at him and I knew he really wanted to know. "Someday I'll tell you everything," I said. We saw Coot in the school doorway waiting for us. "Might even tell him as well," I said, "if I think he might believe it." Then Mrs. Dando was yelling again. "Come on, you two, inside now." That evening, and the evenings that followed, I helped Dan in the house. I mixed wallpaper paste for him and carefully painted door frames and window frames with Dad. We went to see Mum and the baby in the hospital. The baby soon came out of a long sleep and she got stronger and stronger. They took the wires and the tubes out of her and they switched off the machine. The bandages on her chest were smaller and smaller. Every evening she sat in my lap, twisting and turning and gurgling. She learned how to stick out her tongue at us and her mouth and her eyes started to smile. "Look at her," we'd say, "little devil." And Mum would laugh and say, "Watch out, we're coming home soon." I used to look for Dr. McNabola, but I never saw him again. We had lots of Chinese takeaways. Dad winked and said we had to keep it quiet, or Mum would have us on salad for a month. I poked his stomach. "Mightn't be a bad idea, fatty," I joked. "So you don't want a Chinese then?" he said. "No more 27 and 53? "That's right, fatty," I laughed again. "I'll have 19 and 42 instead." "Oh, bit different, eh?" After we'd eaten, I'd go to Mina's. We drew and painted on her kitchen table. We read William Blake and we wrote stories about adventures in old houses and journeys to far-off imaginary places. Each evening, Mina used to ask, "When's she coming home, Michael? I can hardly wait. I haven't seen her yet." We went one more time to the attic before the baby came home. The sun was still shining. It hung low and red and huge over the city. The attic was empty and silent. She pointed to the heap of owl pellets beneath the nest. "Don't go near," she said. "They'll defend their chicks to the death." We stood at the centre, remembering Skellig. "Someone else might find him now," said Mina. "Yes," I said. "I hope they do." Then we saw the outline of a heart scratched into the floorboards beneath the arched window. Just outside the heart was scratched, "Thank you, S," and inside were 3 small white feathers. We picked up the feathers and smiled. "3," said Mina. "One for the baby as well," I said. As we crouched there, the owls flew out into the room and perched on the frame above us. The 2 fledglings appeared, tottering in the shadows by the far wall. They were round and almost naked. Little cheeps came from their wide-open beaks. We gasped at how beautiful they were and how delicate they were as well. Then the owls went out hunting. We stayed for a while. We watched the owls flying back in with the meat from tiny animals they'd killed, and we watched the fledglings gorge themselves on their catch. "Little savages," I said. "That's right," said Mina, "but beautiful savages." We smiled and prepared to tiptoe away. Then the owls flew back in and came to us. They laid something on the floor in front of us. A dead mouse, a tiny dead baby bird. Blood was still trickling through the ripped fur, through the young feathers. The owls flew quickly away again, and we heard them hooting in the thickening night. "Savages," I whispered. "Killers," said Mina. "Great presents, eh?" "They think we're something like them," I said. Maybe we are, more likely than we think, said Mina. We lifted the creatures and tiptoed out. Night, little chicks, we said. Outside, we buried the mouse and the fledgling in a border in the garden. We stared up towards the attic and saw the owls, lit by moonlight now, flying in with more meat for their young. The builders will be coming soon, said Mina. Make sure they do nothing until the chicks have flown away. That Saturday, the builders came to sort the garage out. There were 3 of them, an old man in a cap, Mr. Bately, and his 2 sons, Nick and Gus. They thumped the walls and watched them sway and tremble. They heard the roof creaking and sagging. They scratched the bricks and watched them flake easily away. They yanked Dad's planks off and peered inside. Mr. Bately took his cap off and scratched his bald head. Wouldn't get me in there for danger money, he said. He pondered and wondered. He shrugged and twisted his mouth and looked at Dad. You know what I'm going to say, don't you? He said. Go on, said Dad. Now else for it. Knock it down, start again. Dad looked at me. What do you think, son? He said. I don't know, I said. Easy choice, said Mr. Bately. Knock it down or sit and watch it fall down. Dad laughed. Go on then, he said. Get the stuff out from inside and knock it down. They put steel props up to keep the roof from falling in while they worked inside. They brought the junk out and laid it around Ernie's toilet in the wilderness. All the ancient chests of drawers, the broken wash basins, the bags of cement, the broken doors, the tattered deck chairs, rotten carpets, the ropes, the pipes, the newspapers, the magazines, the coils of cable, the bags of nails. It was endless. Dad and I went through it all as they brought it out. We kept saying, this'll come in useful, then saying, no, it won't, it's just a piece of junk. A trunk came and left a huge steel skip in the back lane. We chucked in everything. We were all covered in dead blue bottles, dead spiders, brick and mortar dust. Little did Dad know it wasn't the first time I'd been covered head to toe. When it was empty, we stood around drinking tea and laughing at the mess. I went to the door alone and stared in. Michael, said Dad. Yes, I said, I know, I won't go in. He told the builders about how desperate I'd been to get in there after we'd moved in. Just like these 2 used to be, said Mr. Bately. Show them something dark and dangerous, and it was the devil's own work to keep them out. I kept on staring. Just rubble and dust and broken pottery there now, and in the far corner a couple of takeaway trays, some brown ale bottles, a scattered handful of feathers, and the pellets. I sighed and whispered, Goodbye, Skellig. Then the builders and Dad were at my back. See, said Mr. Bately, pointing past me. Looks like you've had a dosser spending a night or 2 in there. Lucky the whole lot didn't come down on his head. Then we finished the tea. Mr. Bately rubbed his hands. Right then, lads, he said, time for a bit of knocky down. It only took an hour or so to get the whole thing to the ground. We stood in the kitchen and watched them work with crowbars and sledgehammers and saws. We bit our lips and shook our heads each time a bit of the roof or a bit of wall fell with a massive thump. Soon the garage was just a great pile of bricks and of timber and dust. My word, said Dad. At least we'll have a nice long garden for the baby to play in, I said. He nodded and started talking about the lawn he'd lay and the pond he'd dig and the shrubs he'd plant for the birds to build their nests in. Ah, he said, it'll be a paradise for us all. When it was over, Gus and Nick stood proud and happy with their hands on their hips. Mr. Bately, white as death with dust, gave us the thumbs up and we went out with more tea. Oh, that was good, he said. Aye, said Gus, can't beat a bit of knocky downy. She came home on a Sunday, a beautiful, bright, warm day. It was really spring at last. Dad went off in the car and I stayed behind to finish cleaning the kitchen up. I wrapped last night's takeaway tins in newspaper and threw them in the bin. I put the kettle on for Mum and I got a can of beer and a glass ready for Dad. I went upstairs and slipped the baby's feather under her mattress, and I smiled because I knew she'd have the best of dreams. I waited, looking out into the empty space left by Mr. Bately and his sons. Even the cracked concrete floor was gone now. There was a wooden fence instead of the back wall. I imagined the garden, filled it with all the shrubs and flowers and the grass that would soon be growing where the wilderness had been. I trembled when I heard the car. I couldn't move. Then I took deep breaths and thought of Skellig and went to open the front door. Dad had the baby in his arms and Mum stood there, beaming. Welcome home, Mum, I whispered, using the words I'd practised. She smiled at how nervous I was. I don't really know why I was nervous. It was my mum and sister after all. I suppose I just didn't think this day would come. She took my hand and led me back into the house and into the kitchen. She sat me on a chair and put the baby in my arms. "Look how beautiful your sister is," she said. "Look how strong she is now." I lifted the baby higher. She arched her back as if she was about to dance or fly. She reached out and scratched with her tiny nails at the skin on my face. She tugged at my lips and touched my tongue. She tasted of milk and salt and of something mysterious, like sweet and sour all at once. She whimpered and gurgled. I held her closer and her dark eyes looked right into me, right into the place where all my dreams were, and she smiled. "She'll have to keep going for check-ups," Mum said, "but they're sure the danger's gone, Michael. Your sister really is going to be all right." We laid the baby on the table and all sat round her. We didn't know what to say. Mum drank her tea, Dad let me have a sip of his beer, and we just sat there looking at each other and touching each other happily, and we laughed, and we cried a little bit as well. Soon there was a gentle knock at the door. I went and found Mina standing there. She was shy and quiet, like I'd never seen her before. She started to say something, but it was a mumble, and she ended up just looking into my eyes. "Come and see," I said. I took her hand and led her into the kitchen. She said good evening politely to my parents. She said she hoped they didn't mind. Dad shifted aside and let her in beside the table, and she looked down at the baby. "Oh, she's lovely," she gasped. "In fact, she's extraordinary." And she looked around and laughed with us all. She was really shy again when she went and said, "I brought a present. I hope you don't mind." She unrolled a picture of Skellig with his wings rising from his back and a tender smile on his white, pale face. Mum caught her breath. She stared at me and she stared at Mina. For a moment, I thought she was going to ask us something. Then she simply smiled at us both. "Just something I made up," said Mina casually. "I thought the baby might like to have it on her wall." "It's really lovely, Mina," Mum said, and she took it gently out of Mina's hands. "Thank you," said Mina. She stood there awkwardly again. Well, I'll leave you alone now." I led her back to the door. We smiled at each other. "See you tomorrow, Mina." "See you tomorrow, Michael." I watched her walk away in the late night. From across the street, Whisper came to join her. When Mina stooped down to stroke the cat, I was sure for a second that I saw the ghostly image of her wings. Back in the kitchen, they were talking again about giving the baby a proper name. "Something from William Blake," I said. "Oh, not his mouthfuls again," said Dad. We thought a little longer, and in the end, we simply called her Joy. And that is the end of Skellig Year 6. Now, if you enjoyed Skellig, I know lots of you have, there's actually a sequel to the book by David Almond, and it's called Mina. 6W, it's in our class library. 6H, you are more than welcome to borrow it so long as I know who's got it. It's really, really good. So we'll move on and decide on our next class story really shortly. Okay, bye for now.